Welcome. We have the pleasure today of being joined by President Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, President of Iceland since 1996. President Grímsson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Iceland is the quintessential Arctic nation, and as global warming has opened up the region, some people worried that this would lead to increased competition over resources and shipping routes that global warming has made available. Has that happened?
Well, we have been fortunate in the success of the 8 Arctic countries in creating a framework of cooperation and a prevailing spirit of positive engagement. And I think the new arrivals, the leading Asian powers and the European powers that are now engaged in the Arctic, they respect that legacy. But of course we are seeing individual companies, whether they are shipping companies or harbor companies or companies interested in the oil and the gas and the mining, positioning themselves in different parts of the Arctic. So there is of course a commercial competition, but the comprehensive framework is one of mutual respect and cooperation.
Let's talk about some of those interested powers. Russia is obviously a big player in the Arctic, and recently with Ukraine we've seen some decidedly unstatesmanlike behavior on its part, to put it mildly. Are you worried that Russia might start getting more territorially ambitious in the Arctic?
Well, I hope not. And if we go back about 15 years or so, there was a lot of speculation how Russia would behave in the Arctic. And many were quite suspicious. But the track record so far is that Russia has been positively engaged, has taken a lead together with the US in negotiating the search and rescue agreement, the oil spills agreement, has concluded agreements with Norway regarding long-standing disputes, and been quite positive on scientific cooperation, and has in the last 3 years invited various participants, including myself and the President of Finland and others, to their annual Arctic conference. So up to this moment, there is in the Arctic very little, if anything, one can complain about the Russian performance. And I have said very clearly that I hope we can keep the Arctic free of conflicts in other parts of the world.
And do you think we're seeing that cooperation because, in fact, there's no other way, that it's sort of necessary to work together in order to benefit from the vast resources in the region?
I think so. I think the Arctic, the north, the high north, giving the ice, the extreme weather patterns, the vastness of the territory, humbles people. People realize that despite all our technology, and even despite the military strength of the greatest powers, the tough natural forces in the north can defeat any military power of this kind. So no one country, whether it's Russia or the United States, can alone make a success of the Arctic. So giving the strong northern tradition, the legacy of the Arctic within the Russian history and the Russian culture, I believe that they are very much aware of this, in the same way as people up in Alaska are absolutely aware that Alaska alone cannot make a success of the Arctic.
Now, what about China? It's been investing in the Arctic. It has its own icebreaker, the Snow Dragon. What do you see as its appetite in the region?
Well, China has, in my opinion, 2 very legitimate reasons to engage in the Arctic. One is that the scientific research of the China Polar Institute in the Arctic has demonstrated that there's a very close linkage between the aggressive melting of the Arctic sea ice and extreme weather patterns in China. This was demonstrated a year ago in very dramatic destructions of infrastructures, food productions and other parts in China. So in order to monitor extreme weather patterns in China, they need to do research on the Arctic. The other legitimate reason is that with also the melting of the Arctic sea ice, a new sea route, as we know, opens up through the north, which is much shorter than going through the Suez Canal, saves a lot of fuel. And when China is becoming the leading trading country of the 21st century, it's only natural that it should be interested in a trading route that links China to Europe and Asia and takes 10 days shorter than going through the old routes. And so far, I think China has behaved well in this respect. Its involvement so far has been led by science and the examination of these sea routes, as well as a Chinese company trying to explore, for example, in Greenland, access to the resources. But I think for a leading economic power of the 21st century, this is only to be expected.
If you were advising the United States what it should do in the Arctic, what advice would you give? Some people have argued that America is sort of asleep at the wheel when it comes to Arctic issues.
To some extent you are. I mean, unfortunately, the Arctic, although it's America's backyard, although you are one of the two leading Arctic countries, in Washington, the Arctic so far has a very low priority. Although both Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry have been very much aware of its importance, but somehow this country is always otherwise engaged in other issues. Next year, the US will take on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. This will be a testing time for the US because the chairmanship is not a normal diplomatic function. It is expected to provide a leadership, a policy leadership and a direction. And I hope that in the coming months, both in Washington and elsewhere, the political establishment of the US will realize that this is not only America's backyard, this is already becoming a leading center for global and economic interest in the 21st century. And giving all this discussion about Russia, as you referred to before, it's kind of paradoxical to be so engaged with Russia in Ukraine and be very passive in the Arctic.
It's fascinating stuff. President Grímsson, thank you so much for joining us
today. Thank you very much.